Hi, this is Dr. Schaus, and today we're going to talk about the conservation of tropical biodiversity. We'll talk about what it is, why it's valuable, areas that have high biodiversity that's threatened, and then contrast a couple of different approaches to conserving biodiversity, the species approach and the ecosystem approach. First of all, you might ask, what is biodiversity? Really, by that we mean three different things. Ecosystem diversity, the variety of different types of ecosystems like coral reefs, seagrass beds, kelp forests. We also mean genetic diversity, the different types of genes within a population. And we mean species diversity, the variety of different species that there are. Now, of these three, we usually focus on species richness, which is a measure of how many different species there are within a particular place. It's easy to measure, it's easy to count, it's easy to understand. So that's usually our focus. So this might raise the question, how do we figure out how many species there are on planet Earth? We know there's a lot, but how many? So biologist Terry Irwin in the early 1980s tackled this problem by sampling the canopy of one species of tree in the Panamanian rainforest. The rainforest is a diverse area, so he went there to try to quantify that diversity, and he's an expert in beetles, so he knows them very well. He used an insecticide fogger to spray an insecticide that's short-lasting up into the trees of the rainforest, and this allowed the insects that then would fall out of the tree and be collected on these tarps, and he could mount them and look very closely to see differences between these species. In this one species of tree, he found over 1,200 species of beetle up in the canopy of this rainforest, so tremendous amounts of biodiversity in this area. And of these, he estimated that around 160 species were only found in the canopy of this species of tree, not any other, but specialized to just this species. So he had to pin them, collect them, deposit them in the Smithsonian Institute, and then from there he kind of did some fuzzy math. If there are 160 unique types of beetle found in the canopy of this tree, and we have to account for all the other types of arthropods, such as ants and spiders and things like that, you'd probably end up with about 600 unique species of arthropod restricted to just that species of tree. If we then multiply it by the tree species in the tropical rainforest, there are 50,000 tree species in tropical rainforests of the world, and you multiply these two numbers together and you get 30 million species. At the time, they thought there was about 1.5 million species in the world, and so this estimate kind of greatly expanded that number and our understanding that there might be a lot more species that we don't understand. Now, since this time, since the early 80s, scientists have come up with more refined estimates, and the current thinking is that there's between 7 and 10 million species, which is still a lot. It's not 30 million, but it's a lot more than they originally thought there was on planet Earth. So the next question is, why value biodiversity? Why do we even care? And why are we interested in conserving biodiversity? So at this point, you might pause the video and write down several reasons why you think biodiversity is important. Okay, so here are some examples of reasons why we might value biodiversity. We might want to preserve ecosystem functions to sustain human life. The tropical rainforest produces a lot of oxygen, and we need oxygen to breathe, so there's clearly a benefit to us. Many medicines originated with plants, and as a result, there might be undiscovered species of plants that yield cures to different diseases. So we might be interested for that reason. There might be a benefit to agriculture or industry if there is a pest that has an outbreak and it wipes out a lot of the wheat production. We might need to go back to an ancestral variety of wheat in order to have one that's pest resistant. So by keeping the biodiversity that we have, we might get some benefit for our agricultural systems or for industry. And then aesthetic reasons. This is just simply because we like to look at it. We think it's beautiful. and we can appreciate it. A lot of people pay money to go bird watching or to travel to rare and exotic places just because it's beautiful, and so there's this value in that. Other reasons can include the role of the species in the ecosystem. It protects the function of the system so that other organisms can survive. One species might kind of hold the whole system together, and without that species in place, the system could collapse. There's also evolutionary potential. Diversity comes from other living things that then separate into more than one species, and so with each species you have, there's the potential that it could become even something more. There's ethical considerations. There might be a value in each species in and of itself that we don't have a right to make it go extinct. So these are two sets of reasons. On the left-hand column, they're what we call utilitarian values. These are things that are useful to humanity. We can use them to sustain human life, provide medicines or agriculture, or we just like to look at them. In contrast, all of the reasons on the right-hand column are what we call intrinsic values. They're valued for themselves. The species has a value besides any dollar value that we could put on it, that it functions in the system and it has a right to exist. And so we're not saying that one reason is more important than the other, but these are just two different ways to look at it. And a lot of times these different sets of reasons for protecting biodiversity come in and tie into the two different types of worldviews on this. The anthropocentric worldview is human-focused, and so we want to protect our own skins, versus biocentric is life-centered, and then someone with a biocentric worldview would have more of a focus on the role of the species in the system or the value of each species besides any human dollar value. Now, where is diversity high? These areas denoted in red are identified as biodiversity hotspots, and a paper that came out in 2000 kind of identified these based on their plant characteristics, their mammal diversity, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, but this kind of stands for all the different groups of species that there are in these locations. So what do you notice about these areas? Lots of them are in tropical areas near the equator, and so rainforests and coral reefs have high biodiversity, and those are some of the areas that are tied to that. You'll also notice that a lot of these are coastal areas. For some reason, the coastal areas tend to have a lot more diversity than more inland areas. Third, we have some islands. A lot of islands can have evolution take place in isolation. So the mammal fauna of Madagascar is completely different from the mammal fauna of Africa because it's been separated from Africa for millions of years. And the groups there have evolved and changed and become different species. And so by protecting these islands, we protect unique forms of life that can be found there. And the last grouping is located a little bit further north and a little bit further south than most of the others. So like the California Floristic Province, the Mediterranean Basin, the southwestern area of Australia, and in South Africa, the succulent Karoo. This has a habitat called Mediterranean or chaparral. So it's usually warm most of the year, dry most of the year, maybe a little bit more moist than a desert, but all the rainfall falls in the winter time. For some reason, plant diversity in these areas diversifies very, very rapidly with unique forms cropping up. I grew up in Southern California, and when I took botany in college, every time we would walk through the local nature preserve, our botany professor would point out unique species that were only found from there 30 miles down toward the coast. And that was it. That was the only place that they were found on the planet. And so these areas are unique and have a lot of unique forms of life that are found there and not elsewhere. So the two basic ways to protect biodiversity are the species approach and the ecosystem approach. The species approach obviously is focused on individual species, so identifying which ones are endangered, protecting their critical habitats, maybe captive breeding and reintroduction, but it's all focused on individual species that are at risk. Whereas the ecosystem approach looks to save whole ecosystems, and in doing so, the variety of different life forms that are found there. And by protecting lots of different habitats and lots of different biomes, the idea is that you can protect that and sustain the living things there, either through private purchase or government action. And by protecting and restoring these areas, you can save lots of species. So these are just two fundamental approaches. As an example, the species approach, the Endangered Species Act, is a good example. This has different levels of protection for different species, but if a species is sufficiently rare enough, then that species can be legally protected, and it's against the law to harm it. So endangered and threatened. Endangered is worse, it's in danger of becoming extinct, whereas threatened is in danger of becoming endangered. This protection applies to whole species or even unique subspecies that live in particular areas. The protection for these species is in all of the range or part of the range. So if it's in danger of being wiped out in Florida, it might receive protection in Florida. There are separate lists for the federal government and for the state. So if the federal government's not doing enough to protect a particular species, the state can intervene in the boundaries of that state. And it protects the species, it also protects the critical habitat that's tied to that. Another list that focuses on endangered species is what's called CITES list. This is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and it identifies red-listed organisms that you then cannot transfer from one country to another country. You can't sell them or trade them, and so this provides international levels of protection for these species. Another species approach is captive breeding and reintroduction. So this is an example of the harpy eagle from Belize, and it has been successfully raised in captivity. They can increase the reproduction by growing and incubating each of the eggs separately and then raising them up and training them to live in the wild. And through this reintroduction, they've established a number of additional harpy eagles in this particular area. In contrast, the ecosystem approach takes the whole system. So core areas and buffer zones as a part of a biosphere reserve are good examples of this. A core area is a wilderness area that is unique and kind of set aside, and a lot of times they like to kind of expand the size of that area by protecting buffer zones around that. So that allows limited human intervention in these buffer zones and a more gradual transition to the area outside the reserve. So it's not a sharp line inside the reserve versus outside the reserve. And so by protecting a bigger area, you can support more species. Good example of this is Costa Rica. About 25% of Costa Rica's land is protected as national park or some sort of reserve. Surrounding these, if you include these buffer zones, it basically interconnects some of the areas to an extent and expands the areas of protection. These are some of the protected marine areas in northeastern Belize. And this starts with Zone A, which is the Holchan Marine Reserve, and that's a no-take zone, so people are prohibited from fishing in there and harvesting things. If you go diving or snorkeling, you can't touch anything. And to get this passed with the local fishermen, they had to promise them something that was of advantage to them. So in Zone B, they were allowed to continue fishing for conch, which is a really large snail. And in this particular area, it's very sustainably managed. So by restricting it to people that had licenses at that point, the fishermen saw a benefit because there was increased harvest for them. They couldn't catch things in Zone A or Zone D, but they were willing to make that trade-off. They also protected Zone C, which includes a lot of mangrove islands, and so you have different types of habitat receiving different levels of protection. Over the years, it's expanded to the zones that have the Roman numerals, and then recently, conservation zones F, G, and H. So G is Mexico Rocks, general use area, and H is the no-take zone in that area. So this kind of follows that zone of a core zone, H, and buffer zones surrounding that. So lots and lots of diversity. This is a grouper that I took a picture of from the Shark Ray Alley, which is zone D. And there's larger fish that are in this area. There's a greater diversity of species and a lot of rare species that can be found in these reserves and nowhere, at least you're less likely to find them in other locations. Another ecosystem approach is connecting different core habitats with corridors to allow species to migrate between one and another. So the jaguar is a particular conservation interest in Central and South America. The key habitats are identified in green or gray, and the areas of corridors are shown in red or in yellow. So these allow the jaguars to go from one area to another, and the ones that they're most interested in are the red areas where there's a threat that with increased human development it could cut off their movement from one habitat to another, and that restricts the gene flow and you get inbreeding, and it could potentially be a problem. Focusing on Belize, there's two areas of habitat corridors that have been identified to promote movement of jaguar between these core areas shown in green. So to get from the northwestern part of Belize to the central areas, the Central Belize Corridor allows for jaguar movement between those habitats. And then in the south, the Southern Belize Corridor allows the jaguar populations in the Maya Mountains and the Mountain Pine Ridge to move down toward the coastal mangrove areas and then down toward Honduras. So by thinking of these populations across wider areas and how those areas are interconnected, you can better conserve these species. For more information on these topics, check out some of these links. Thanks.